So I've put together this presentation because I think there's issues in how Agile methodologies are talked about at the moment and how they're articulated in terms of their link in to the strategy of the organization in which they're employed. Now, I'm not 100% convinced on that this perspective is necessarily the right one, but I find it a very interesting topic, and I'm hoping my slightly provocative title here will incentivize people to engage and hopefully point out where I'm right or where I'm wrong or have a conversation about it. I'm going to make the assumption as I go through this that people who are watching this, given they've clicked on something about Agile, have some base level understanding of what I mean by Agile methodologies or Agile principles. And so if you don't, pop it into YouTube. There's a bunch of resource on that. The core thesis that I have, which I hope to articulate there and convince you of, is that agility is a strategic tool more than an operational one, and I'll hopefully uncover what I mean by that as we go. And the Agile development's often poor reputation is due to both practitioners and business leaders misunderstanding of what it seeks to do, and I'm gonna walk through that. So what I'll do is I'll go through why I think there's a misunderstanding, how we can address that misunderstanding through being more systematic in our linking of Agile methodologies to strategy in a way that's measurable and controllable, and then a little conclusion at the end there. So to go into what I think the root of the misunderstanding is, and why, especially at the moment, Agile is getting a pretty bad rap, and people are talking about it's not effective, it doesn't work. In order to explain it, we need to start with I think, generalized view of when we think about process improvement or organizational improvement, how do we think about and measure that traditionally? And I think there's two key axes that we can generalize to. First one is predictability. So that is saying, how sure can we be about what something's going to be like in the future, given where we are now? So very simply, low predictability, we're talking about we don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future. High predictability is we have high certainty. And then the other axis is efficiency. What's the cost to get to a particular goal? Where low efficiency is high cost to get to a goal, and high efficiency, low cost to get to a goal. Fairly basic. So if we think about what's the relationship between these two axes in traditional process improvement, is they are generally correlated. So when I'm talking about traditional process improvement, I'm thinking things which are often inherited from a manufacturing lineage. We're thinking about Lean, we're thinking about Six Sigma, we're thinking about even Kanban, and obviously a lot of people will debate my classification here, but I think it's a reasonable thing to say that these methodologies in general emphasize standardization, they emphasize repeatability, they emphasize saying, okay, let's make sure we do the same thing in the same way again and again. And because that's the fundamental focus of initiatives that drive business improvement through increase in efficiency, through standardization, we tend to have a positive correlation between efficiency, cost to do something, and predictability, what we can say about the future. If we think about a support process, as an example, at the very start, it might all be very ad hoc. Different people do things in different ways. We come in, we do some process improvement, we standardize the triage, we standardize the different levels of support, we standardize how things get moved between different teams depending on the type of problem. As we do that, we have standard operating procedures. and given that, what it will then mean is that if we take any particular item early on in the process, we can probably, with some degree of reasonable certainty, say how long is this going to take to make its way through the system, given some other constraints or what the context is at the time. So if we now add in another axis here to think about, which is agility. So what is agility? When we talk about agility, think it's often talked about in a very abstract way. How can we make that measurable and specific so we can be on the same page when we're talking about it? So to me, agility is very simply a measure of what is the cost to change direction. So if I'm going one way, whether that's I'm physically moving or I have my business system pointed at a particular goal, we're going to build this feature or we're going to pursue this market, and I decide to change that direction, whether I'm running there and then I want to change the direction I'm running, or I'm pursuing market A, I want to pursue market B, what is the cost of that change? So high agility is where there is very low cost to that change, and then high agility is low cost to the change, and then low agility is high cost to change. So maybe we've done a whole lot of investment going in one direction, and we decide to change direction, and we have to throw away that investment. And if we now think about what would the relationship between predictability and agility look like, we can see it's different. So because Agile methodologies focus on responding to change, they focus on not committing to a particular future, but optimizing for the ability to flex as our context changes. What it means is that in order to optimize for agility, i.e. have no cost to change direction, the point in time at which we have highest agility is the point in time at which we haven't made a decision on exactly where we're going to go. And then as we commit more to going in a particular direction, our agility will decrease because we're making more investment. We're saying, okay, well, I wasn't sure I was going to pursue this particular market, but now I've gone and done some market research. Now maybe I've done some MVPs. I've gone and talked to some customers, whatever that might be. As we do that, our cost to not do that increases because we'd waste all that money if we completely change direction. And this is, obviously we can do this in a way where ideally things are more reusable, but for the purpose of this example, we're talking, I have mutually exclusive decisions to make. As we go further down one path, we will have more information about the nature of outcomes in that path. We'll be able to make more informed predictions about what might happen in the future. But if we decide to change, we lose that. So agility, whereas efficiency and predictability are generally positively correlated, and there's a lot of different ways we can think about efficiency, but generally speaking, if we're talking about typical process improvement, are positively correlated. Agility and predictability are the inverse of that. And to me, that dynamic there, that difference really is the root of misunderstanding. Because when Agile methodologies or methodologies designed to increase agility are just sold as a alternative to process improvement, we could do it this way, but instead we're going to do it this way, as opposed to a fundamentally different approach that is prioritizing something else, then we'll get ourselves into a position where they are assessed in the same way that any other process improvement would be assessed. And I think anyone who's interacted with the implementation of Agile methodology in an organization will be familiar with people asking, how many story points is equal to a man day, or given the velocity of the team, how long is it going to take me to do things? This is because people are used to thinking about, okay, as my system gets better, I'm going to be able to tell more about the future. You are telling me these Agile methodologies are now in place. Tell me what's going to happen in the future. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding about what we're trying to do. What that leads to is people, especially leaders, misjudging the success or otherwise, and also practitioners both not effectively measuring what success will look like and not effectively communicating fundamentally what we're trying to do here. So how do we get around that? What I think we need to do is ask the question, given what I've said before, given the inherent difference between traditional process versus Agile methodology implementation, or a focus on agility over what we might think of as traditional efficiency, how can we articulate agility in a way that resolves this misunderstanding and presents the outcome of an agile system in a manner that is understandable and actionable for decision makers. It isn't enough just to say, okay, well, now we've got the ceremonies in place, now we can move our backlog around. Well, how do we make it so that there is a compressed representation of the dynamics of that system in a manner that can be consumed into a strategic context and inform decision makers on the type of decisions they're able to make given those underlying dynamics? So how do we achieve this without our senior leaders needing to understand the detail of processes or ceremonies, or this is what a story point is, or this is the structure of our teams, or all of this? Especially in larger organizations, people don't have time to do that. We want to do it in a manner that still reflects that core principle of optimizing for the ability to respond to change, and critically as well, in a way that is measurable. And this is not just about agile methodologies for that last bullet point there. If we are doing process change or process improvement and we cannot measure what we think the outcomes, we can't articulate our hypothesis in terms of some sort of telemetrics, there's no point to it. It's all just PowerPoints and opinions, no matter how good your animations and transitions in your PowerPoints are. So how do we do this? The core approach that I think is most effective in linking agile practices through to strategy in a manner that can be consumed within that strategic context is through the articulation of the Agile curve, which we've got in orange here, which is the plotting of the relationship for a given system between agility and predictability. So depending on the system that we're talking about, there will be this curve might look quite different. We might have a relatively simple system where we've got a pretty linear relationship. As we invest more, we see a corresponding increase in predictability through to we've actually fully done the thing, we know what's going to happen, and it's relatively linear. We might see a slightly more complicated system where we have to invest quite a bit at the start, but then it plateaus and we can increase our predictability without too much more investment, and then it kind of drops off at the end as we need to work out the final bits. Or we might have much more complex systems where we really it's much more difficult to make any real solid calls about what the future is going to look like, and we fundamentally hit a plateau because of the underlying dynamics of that system. And so what I want to talk through here is how we would go about drawing this curve at a very high level, and I can do another video on kind of more specifics at a very high level, and then how that links through, or how that gives us the ability from talking about our agile improvement in terms of these curves, how that gives us the ability to link it through to a strategic context. So how can we think about drawing these curves? We're starting a new agile project, we put in some new methodologies. What's it going to look like? At the very start, we will have no historic data, so we can't do anything. And we're going to have inconsistent practice. So things will probably be all over the place. As we start to continue, and the key thing here is as we embed consistent ways of working, and typically in agile practice, we are varying the backlog and allowing us to move what we're doing things around. Because we're moving that, we have to fix process, we have to fix teams. If you're changing your teams all the time, and you're changing your process all the time, and you're changing your backlog all the time, you cannot make predictions about the future. You have to have something in there which is consistent in order doing that. And that's just, I think, physics. So as we embed consistent ways of working, what we can do is we can go from inconsistent practice where we might have scattered points through to a relatively high variance curve, and then over time, we're never going to get to a single line like I've drawn here. It is purely for illustrative purposes, but we can start to reduce that variance down, again, as we implement standardized practice. And if we think about how might we use these sorts of curves to talk about our agile implementation, improvement, whatever initiative, whatever we want to call it, this gives us the ability to articulate to our stakeholders, okay, what are we trying to do at a point in time? Well, at the moment, our practice is so inconsistent that we can't, that if you ask us a question about what is for a given unit of work, what's that going to look like in the future? What's the outcome of that going to be? How long is it going to take to level? Whatever we might want to ask, we can say, well, at the moment we can't, based on the data, we cannot answer that question. We can we can take a guess, but we can't. What we are initially trying to do with an implementation is make sure that at least to some level we can answer that question for you, Mr. or Mrs. Decision maker. So it gives us a much more quantified response to say either at the moment it's just a guess, or if we're saying we need to do more investment in order to standardize our processes and get things better, because again we can articulate it in terms of these curves. So once we can draw them, so initially this is linking agility to strategy through being able to articulate the initial goal of the implementation of agile processes or agile methodologies in terms of being able to create a quantified representation of the base state of the system in terms of the trade-off between agility and predictability. Once we've done that, what does that then allow us to do? Okay, we've possibly signed our decision makers on that. What it allows us to do is then articulate the dynamics of the system in a manner that enables our decision makers to understand what that base state implies in terms of the constraints of the type of strategic decisions that can be made. So what I mean by that, let's imagine, I'll start with this right-hand one first, that we are working with some decision makers who say, what I want to do is have lots of MVPs going really fast and kill them really fast. And what we know is that the system is that the Agile curve looks like this, where we know at the very start we actually have to invest quite a lot in order to get not much information about the future. But then we're going to hit a point where for not too much more investment, we can quite substantially increase our predictability. That gives us the ability to go back to our decision makers and say, hey, that isn't the wisest strategy in this situation. What we really need to be doing is picking a fewer number of items, committing to a certain investment envelope with this arbitrary curve here, probably about the stage where we know we're starting to get diminishing returns. But if we take a lot of things through and just cut them here, then it is not a wise use of investment, because we're putting money into something which doesn't actually give us information about the future. Versus, perhaps we look at a different system and we say, okay, well, this system, we know at the very start with relatively little investment, we can get a reasonable amount of certainty, and then we have a big drop-off. This is the type of system that if we can that if we observe a curve like this, we can say, yes, the strategy to do there is to say, let's put a high number of items through the very top of our process and chop them off as soon as they get to around about here, where we have at least some increase in information for, relatively speaking, not that much in investment. So this is how we can use the concept of this curve to link, without having to talk about all of the details of the setups of teams and the particular processes and ceremonies. And this team has a 5-week sprint, this team has a 2-week sprint. Don't care about any of that. What we care about is when we look at the telemetry coming off, the operationalization of those processes. What does that tell us about the fidelity with which we can make statements about the future at a certain point along that process? And then finally, what it does. So we're thinking about this in 3 stages. So stage 1 I talked about before is when we're first putting the processes in place. We can articulate those processes in terms of giving us the ability to draw the curve. Once we've drawn the curve, we can then talk about them in terms of being able to articulate to our decision makers what are the constraints on the type of decisions that you might want to make or the way that you might operate the system. And then finally, as we're doing improvement initiatives, we can articulate those initiatives over time in terms of how do we expect them to shift the curve. So if we did have this curve, and we're saying, and one of our decision makers is saying, we want to do a lot of small experiments and then kill them quickly, then what we always want to be doing is moving this curve right. So we can say, hey, we did an initiative with team A, and off the back of that initiative, we can see we've now moved that curve right. So now for not so much investment, we can get more predictability. This is something that we might want to replicate elsewhere. And again, it gives us a way to articulate an abstract representation of how we're trying to affect the underlying dynamics of that system in a way that's relevant to making strategic decisions. So, to summarize all of that, the way that we can link Agile methodologies through to strategy is using real data to draw that Agile curve. Everything needs to be measurable. Reducing the curve variance. The initiatives that we do, we can articulate in terms of their effect on the shape of that curve, ideally moving them right so that we reduce the trade-off. So we say, hey, you can know more about the future with less investment. And then what that does is it allows our leaders to understand what are the operational constraints that are present because of the underlying dynamics of the system as captured through actual data over time. And they can take those into account when crafting their organizational strategy. Which brings us on to the conclusion. So the core value of Agile practices, if captured in the way that I've suggested, is that it allows quantified measurement of the impact of an ability to respond to change. We're not just talking about things theoretically and saying, well, if we start doing 2-week sprints now, or we start using story points instead of man days, or all of these other methodologies, it'll give you the ability to be more flexible. It will do that, but we can do that in a way that is based on actual data, where people don't have to understand that detail. And then what that enables is strategic control of operational processes. And what I mean by that is decision makers not only being able to understand the implication of the dynamics of that of the underlying processes, but also being able to say, hey, I want you to move the curve right. I don't know how you're going to do it. I don't know. In some situations we may have to that base dynamic may be a byproduct of the underlying technology, maybe a byproduct of the people, it may be a byproduct of the capabilities, it may be a byproduct of the structure of our organization. So there's a whole lot of different things. But what in addition to being able to understand the nature of the system, decision makers can then say, okay, what would it take to move the curve right? And we can go back and say, all right, well, we think the main constraint in this system is the technology. We need to invest more here because we think that allows us to do faster releases, or it allows us to make decisions quicker, whatever that might be. Without, as they seek to apply that control, having to understand the detail at that point in time. And this is what I mean by agility is a strategic tool more than an operational one. Insofar as agility, if turned into a quantified, measurable axis, gives us the ability to link operations to strategy in a manner that those two things can be much more tightly linked than they would be able to be if we didn't essentially encapsulate the processes and communicate them through a compressed representation. And within this way of understanding it, the role of practitioners is to build and understand the dynamics of the system, which then enables the leaders to use that abject curve to understand what's the strategic constraints that they are operating under. That is my little presentation. If anyone thinks I am right or wrong, I will put my LinkedIn in the description of this video, and I'd be very keen to have any conversations. Thank you.